Welcome back to the Survivor's Guide to Thriving podcast, the show for people who are ready to break out of survival mode in order to build a truly thriving life. I'm Amanda Sollman, and along with Mark Jewell and the rest of my team here at Mark Jewell Speaking and Training, we break down common roadblocks that keep people stuck surviving and share ideas to help you thrive each and every day. If there is one concept or piece of content that we teach here at MJST that I had to pick as my absolute favorite, it would be the story framework. If you've had me as a coach or if you've been through a workshop with me at some point in time, there is a very good chance that you have heard me talk about the story framework and go back to it time and time again. And the reason that it just feels so prevalent for me is I think it is one of the most easily applicable concepts we teach and can be layered into a whole bunch of challenges that we all go through on any given day. And so what's funny is, the story framework is my favorite concept, and I have been reading a lot of personal development books lately, and a lot of them have actually helped me dig into this concept of stories at a much deeper level. And so I really appreciate that because I always love taking something that I already find really relevant and layering in additional content, additional perspective, additional ideas that helps me understand that concept from maybe a different or a deeper viewpoint. And so one of those books that I recently read is a book called Rising Strong by Brene Brown. Now, some of you might know Brene Brown from her work on vulnerability, maybe from her TED Talk, or from her book, Daring Greatly. Mark and I actually talked about vulnerability and shame and a lot from Daring Greatly back in an earlier episode of the podcast. But Rising Strong is one of her newer books. And it really is about the stories we tell ourselves. And so what I wanted to do today is kind of walk you all through the work I've been doing in my head to take the story framework that we teach here at MJST and take it to an even deeper level with some of the concepts that Brene brings up in her book, because I just think it gives us an even better, more holistic view of this behavior that we all go through on any given day in any number of situations, and give us some tools to work through that. So before I dive into Brene's work and how it layers in, I want to take a step back and sort of re-highlight what the story framework is. If you've been through one of our training or coaching programs, you have heard this concept, but maybe there's some of you out here who the podcast is your only vantage point for MJST, and maybe you haven't heard this concept yet. So I'm going to give you the really high level. And so the story framework is all about how we develop these stories in our heads. Whether that's your story about your boss or your story about your marriage or your story about your health and what you think you're capable of there. We all live day in and day out based on a series of stories. Some people might call them, beliefs or perspectives, viewpoints, but I like story because I think stories are not set in stone. Stories can always be changed. And maybe some of those other things we like to believe that they're set in stone, whereas stories can always be rewritten. And so the interesting thing is that when we are creating these stories, we are always sort of going through a basic process to get there. Okay. So the first step in the process is what we refer to as a trigger, right? So a trigger is that person or that situation or that behavior that makes you go, X made me feel Y, where X is some external thing that created some sort of feeling in you. So it might be, when my boss talked to me that way, it made me so mad. Or when my spouse talked to me this way, it made me feel insignificant. Or when my kid didn't do their chores, it made me feel like they just don't care, right? Like it's always an external thing, the trigger. But that trigger always makes us say, ugh, the trigger made me feel something. But what's really interesting is it doesn't automatically go from trigger to feeling. There's a step in between. So as we go along this process of the story framework, the first step is the trigger. The second step is actually a thought. Okay. So let's say your coworker drops the ball on something. Your first thought might actually be they're so lazy, right? Or your boss doesn't give you the feedback that you want. Maybe your first thought is he must think I'm doing terribly. Or your spouse doesn't load the dishwasher. Your first thought might be they don't care about helping me out around the house, right? There's always a thought that comes as a result of the trigger. And that thought will always trigger some sort of feeling. Maybe the feeling is insignificance or anger, frustration, stress, sadness. I should say triggers, thoughts, and feelings can be positive as well, right? So let's say you see your kids succeed and that thought is, man, they're great. And that feeling is joy or something like that, right? You can have positive triggers, thoughts, and feelings. We just know that when it comes to the things we want to change in our life, it's usually not about the positive ones. So you'll hear me use a lot of examples that maybe come from more of the negative or at least room for improvement type examples, okay? So you've got your trigger, which creates a thought, which creates a feeling. And what's really interesting is that the thoughts and feelings that we all assign to a trigger are very much based on what we refer to as our hardwiring. Okay. So at a very high level, our hardwiring is all of these beliefs and opinions and outlooks on life that we've been developing over a lifetime of experiences. And in a big part, it's based on the experiences that we had as a kid, which, might seem like, oh, how can what happens to me as a kid impact me as an adult? But I think for anybody who's raised kids or anybody who has ever, whether you're a teacher or whatnot, and you've got some background in early childhood development, you know that those early years are really impactful, right? I bet there's some of you out there who either went through it or can imagine, like, if you're the child of parents who went through a really messy, nasty divorce when you were little, think of how that still impacts your view of relationships to this day, good or bad, right? Or think of if you grew up in a household where, work was really highly valued. Maybe you grew up on a farm or just in a household where people seem to work from sun up till sundown, and it was always preached that hard work will get you anywhere. That might impact your view of work as an adult very differently than maybe somebody else who didn't grow up in that situation. And so the thoughts and feelings that we have about any given trigger as an adult are very highly impacted by that hardwiring we formed, as children and then has been reinforced throughout our lives. And it's different from person to person. The really basic example that I always kind of throw out there is imagine that the trigger is you get cut off in traffic. Okay. Now, one person, based on their hardwiring and their experiences and beliefs, might have the thought that, man, that guy's a jerk and, feels angry, right? So that could be one possible response to a trigger. You also, I'm sure, know people who they get cut off in traffic and their first thought is, man, he must really have somewhere to go. And you don't feel anger. You might really not feel much of anything. Maybe you feel sympathy or empathy that person needs to get somewhere. Maybe there's an emergency. And in those cases, right, the trigger is the exact same. Both people got cut off by someone in traffic, but the thought and feeling they have about it is very different because their hardwiring is different. And I just think that's a really important thing to remember because, especially when it comes to marriages or work setups, like we can sometimes get frustrated with the people around us. And we have to constantly remind ourselves that they're responding differently based on a different set of hardwiring than we come to the situations with. So it's something to keep in mind. So again, going back to sort of this process of the story framework, we've got our trigger, which creates a thought, which creates a feeling. Okay. Now, I mentioned because things are based on our hardwiring, those thoughts and feelings are pretty much instinctual. You think, man, when someone cuts you off in traffic, how long does it take to go from getting cut off to being angry? Like milliseconds, right? So it's very subconscious and very instinctual. But what happens next is actually very conscious. And that's that each of us will choose to take an action. So those two people who got cut off in traffic, let's just go back to that example. One person could get angry and be very mad based on their hardwiring. They still could choose not to tailgate the guy or not to, speed up and cut him off as revenge, right? Some people would do that. Some people wouldn't. The feeling is still the same. They're still angry. But at the end of the day, they have a conscious choice in how they react to that feeling. Do they choose to feed into the anger and have a little road rage? Or do they choose to, yes, recognize I'm annoyed, but it's not worth putting myself or the people in my car in danger? And so that's the role of the action. It's conscious. Just a caveat. Not taking action is still an action, right? When we avoid a situation, that's still a conscious choice that we're making based on our thoughts and feelings. So trigger happens, we have a thought, we have a feeling, which is largely instinctual, and then we take an action. Based on the action we take, we are going to get some sort of result. The result could be good, the result could be bad. Okay? But here's what happens is that result can often turn into the next trigger in the process. And you just start doing this cycle: trigger, thought, feeling, action, result, trigger, thought, feeling, action, result. And you do it over and over and over again. But what we find is that when we do that cycle over and over and over again without changing anything, that's when we start to create stories. Or in some cases, reinforce pre-existing stories. So let me give you an example. The trigger is that my boss doesn't give me the feedback I want. Okay. My thought is, he must think that I am terrible at my job. And the feeling is a failure, disappointment, stress, sadness in myself, right? Because I must be doing a terrible job. And so the action I take is I start to disconnect and disengage from what I'm doing. And the result is I get fewer sales or whatever your job is, right? I get less outcomes. And that less outcomes acts as another trigger of, not getting business. And so my first thought is, again, I must be terrible, which leaves me feeling disappointed and stressed. And so I keep disengaging more. And so whenever I do that over and over again, maybe I start to create a story that I'm no good at this job, right? Or that my boss doesn't care how I'm doing, right? Those are the stories we start to tell because we allow ourselves to fall into a pattern of the same triggers, thoughts, feelings, and actions over and over again, despite the fact that we don't like the results. Okay. And so what we always encourage folks to do is to really look at, if I don't like the results I'm getting, how can I change up my actions in the short term? And then over time, change up my thoughts in the long term in a way that might get me better results. So if I'm not getting the feedback I want from my boss, how do I initiate a conversation that might uncover some information that I can use to improve my skills or to feel more confident in the job I'm doing? Or, if I don't like how disconnected I feel from my spouse, how could I break the pattern by initiating weekly date night where we can protect some time to connect with each other? Right? So it all comes back to, if I don't like the results I'm getting, if I don't like the story I'm writing, how can I start writing a different one? Okay. So that's the story framework on a really high level. And I want you all to have sort of an understanding of what that looks like so that we can talk about, okay, now how do we take it a level deeper by taking some of the ideas that Brene Brown has and layering them on, okay? And so let's go ahead and make that pivot. What does Brene say about the story? Because it's cool. She uses the same language of stories we're telling ourselves. And she takes it from a couple of different angles. And so when she talks about stories, she breaks them into 3 parts. So the first is the reckoning. The second is the rumble, and the third is the revolution. And you'll find what's really interesting is that each of these parts sort of correlates to pieces of the story framework, which we talk about. Okay, so the first stage of Brene's approach is what she calls the reckoning. And this is where you become aware that you are having some sort of emotional reaction to a trigger. Okay. Now, where this parallels in the story framework is to those first 2 steps after the trigger of having a thought and having a feeling. One of the things that I think is interesting that Brene talks about is that many of us don't even recognize the fact that we're having an emotional response. It's so instinctual. We've become so used to it that we are oblivious to the fact that it's even happening. Okay. And she actually ties this back into, some of the earlier conversations from Daring Greatly, from her TED Talk that many of us actually learned very early in our life that we're supposed to ignore or suppress feelings and emotions, right? We're actually taught that there is shame in being aware of how you feel or verbalizing how you feel, okay? So, toughen up, just deal with it, right? That's what we're always taught. So just toughen up, push through it. Or, we're often taught, there's no place for feelings. I bet there are many people, and maybe you're not one of these, and in which case it's great, but I bet there's many of you who grew up in a household where we didn't talk about how we feel, right? Maybe we just, always operated in an underlying sense of gruffness or anger or frustration, that was the norm. Or maybe you grew up in a place where everybody, tough it up, put a happy face on and deal with it, right? And so there are many of us as adults now who, because that's our hardwiring to ignore or suppress our feelings, find ourselves now as adults really struggling with, we're getting these results we don't like, right? Relationships aren't going well. I'm not happy at work. But we don't realize that part of that is coming back to us and our feelings about the situation and how we're choosing to deal with that. And so I really like this idea of having a reckoning with your thoughts and feelings. So, it's one thing, right? So in the story framework, how we take this a level deeper is, okay, the trigger happens. I think this, I feel this, to ask myself, oh, I didn't even realize that was happening. I didn't even realize that when my boss didn't give me feedback, it was making me feel disappointed. Or when, my spouse didn't ask for my opinion, that it made me feel insignificant in the relationship, right? Oh, wow, I didn't even realize that was where this was coming from. So getting really in touch with what are those feelings and being more aware of them. And so that's step 1, reckoning. Holy cow, I'm feeling something, okay? Which automatically then moves you, or I shouldn't say that. It does not automatically move you. Like I actually, you can feel, you can recognize I'm angry, I'm sad, I'm disappointed, and not do this next step. But I think this next step is where the real change can come. And so Brene calls this the rumble. Okay. And in our in the story framework, we might call this part of the action you take. Because I should say actions can be internal or external, right? So if I recognize, oh, I'm feeling a certain way, I can go external, like I can go have that tough conversation, I can set up that date night, whatever, external and outward action. Part of the action could be internal though, which is I need to sit down and reflect on what the heck is going on with me and what I want to do with that information. And so internal or external. And I would say the way that Brene tends to set this up is really heavy on the internal. And that's why I like layering it into the story framework, because I think it puts a heavier emphasis on those internal actions that we get to take. And so when she talks about the rumble, she talks about, okay, I just had a reckoning where I became more aware of, crap, I'm feeling something right now. And now I get to work through that. I get to work my way through what are these thoughts? What are these feelings I'm having? Okay. And so she actually presents a couple of strategies that I think are really helpful. One is, pardon my language, but I like the phrasing, what she calls the shitty first draft. Okay. And the shitty first draft is where you catch yourself feeling something and you start to write that story out. Okay. So it could look like, the story I'm telling myself is that my boss doesn't think I'm doing a good job. And that makes me feel really insignificant. And when I feel insignificant, I disconnect. Right. And I get really short tempered and I don't take the action that I want. And in my body, it just feels tense and stressed and it just makes me want to scream. Right. So that's that shitty first draft of the story you're telling. My boss doesn't think I'm doing a good job. He doesn't care. He'd be fine if I wasn't here doing it anymore. And why I find this helpful is Brene actually recommends writing this down and allowing this to be your inner 5-year-old, right? Say the most ridiculous things, draw the most ridiculous conclusions, because then once you've written it down, it becomes much easier to look at it and go, oh, maybe that's my inner 5-year-old throwing a temper tantrum, or my inner 5-year-old just wanting someone to tell me they love me. Or it's my inner 5-year-old who is blaming others because they don't have the capacity yet to look inward, right? When we write that shitty first draft down, we realize how overdramatic it often is. And I will tell you, it's usually worst case scenario. Okay. So I love that idea. Write the shitty first draft of the story you're telling yourself, and no holds barred, no judgment, just write it down. Okay. Because once you've got it written down, you get to then ask a couple of other questions as part of this reckoning, as part of this action you're taking based on the feelings. And so she says, once you've got that shitty first draft written down, ask yourself 3 questions. 1, what more do I need to know about this situation? Okay. So maybe my boss is under a lot of pressure that I don't know anything about. Or maybe my spouse is feeling a certain way about me and they haven't told me that. And that's why they're short, or they've got a tone that doesn't seem very nice. What's going on in this situation that maybe I'm oblivious to right now? Second question is, what more do I need to know about others? This is, from our perspective, this is a really great place to use things like strengths, right? So maybe the reason why I can't read my boss and I have no idea what he's thinking is because he has emotional control as a strength and he's got a really good poker face, right? Maybe I need to learn that my boss was never really taught how to be a manager. And so he or she is also sort of figuring this out on the fly, right? What else do I need to know about the other people in my story that might help uncover some information for me to work through it? And then finally, what more do I need to know about myself in this situation, right? So maybe I need to figure out, where is this anger coming from? what are the thoughts that are driving this anger, or what's driving this sadness? What have I experienced that has created hardwiring that drives this instinct to feel sad based on a certain trigger? Or somebody brought this up to me recently. What is driving my fear of conflict? In order for me to deal with that fear, I got to know more about myself and where that's coming from. And so I love the idea writing that shitty first draft just to get it all out of your head, but then really analyzing it and saying, what more do I need to know about the situation, other people, or myself that could help me work through that shitty first draft, that story, so that I can figure out, is it actually true, or are there some things that I can do to uncover more truth or to change the story in the first place? I think what was a real big takeaway for me as I was reading about this in Brene's book and comparing it to the story framework is that this really does require a level of vulnerability and introspection that not all of us are super comfortable with. Let's be real. Sometimes taking a deep, hard look at yourself is not always comfortable. But I think when we are brave enough to sort of go internal, to sort of try and understand ourselves, the situation, other people better, it actually allows us to pick a better external action, right? It might allow us to be a little more purposeful in creating the results that we ultimately want. So let's say that I have a story in my head that is making me feel insignificant. When I'm able to write that out or verbalize it, even to somebody else, sometimes talking through this can help as well, I might realize that's the pause I needed to not instinctually pick a fight or snap back at someone, right? It helps me pause and then decide to maybe ask more questions versus defaulting to, my most instinctual response. So that's the rumble. Okay. So we had the reckoning, which is being more aware that we're having thoughts and feelings. If we compare to the story framework, thoughts and feelings, being more aware of that. Then we have the rumble, which is figuring out what are these thoughts and feelings and where the heck are they coming from and what do I do with that? Okay. And then the third part that she talks about is what she calls the revolution. And this is the change that happens for us over time when we interrogate and become more aware of our stories over and over and over again, right? When we make it a habit to, in that action category in the story framework, to pause, to reflect, and then to purposefully choose our next external action with more clarity of what we're trying to create. And so that happens over time. And I think that's something we talk about in our programs too, right? Changing the story is a process. It comes by going through that cycle and choosing a different action over and over and over again. Because, to some extent, your triggers aren't going to go away, right? I read a post from Mel Robbins on Instagram this morning that said something along the lines of, no matter how much you love them, they're still going to load the dishwasher wrong, right? If you're in a marriage, I'm sure you can find whatever that habit is in your spouse that they just don't do the way you want them to. So the trigger is not going to go away, but you've got to figure out how to love them anyways. Or, if there's a trigger that a coworker does, right? Just maybe the way they approach their work, you most likely don't have power to get rid of them, right? You can't remove the trigger, but you get to control yourself. Right. And I have had numerous clients who really take this idea of the story framework, and to some extent, without even knowing it, take Brene's ideas of the reckoning, the rumble, and the revolution to heart, who start to realize that the situation they're in, the triggers they're dealing with, they don't have to change for their outlook on the situation or the trigger to change. right? So the situation didn't change. How I chose to see the situation shifted. And that often makes all the difference. So that is my sort of deep dive into the story framework, into how I see some of the work that Brene Brown is doing, layering into that. Obviously, this is just a real toe dip in the water of Brene's work, and I would highly recommend, if you're looking for a personal development book, go check out Rising Strong. I really enjoyed it. I think it's actually, I've read a lot of her books, and I think it's up there as one of my favorites because, again, it's like the story framework. It's very practical. It's very applicable because we're all going through some of these struggles every single day. And so with that, I just want to do a quick plug and teaser. If you have not already, head over to the App Store, whether that's Google Play if you're on an Android device, or to the Apple App Store if you're on iPhone, and check out the Thrive Today app. That's hashtag Thrive Today. Don't forget the hashtag or you won't be able to find it. But this app is going gangbusters right now for us. It is a community of people who are ready to end survival and really choose to thrive today. We've got a great community of folks. We've got some great content up there and some tools too to help you stay accountable as you're trying to reach your goals. And so that's at a real high level. Check out the app. And then on next week's episode, Mark and I are going to be talking a little bit about the science behind that app and ways that we can use this to make personal and professional growth a little more fun and engaging. So make sure to come back next week and check out that conversation between Mark and I. So thanks for tuning in this week, and we will see you next time. Thanks for tuning in to this week's episode. If you like what you heard, make sure to jump over to Apple Podcasts and leave us a rating and review. We appreciate the feedback, and it helps other people find the show. On that same note, if you enjoyed this episode, make sure to share it with a friend. As always, if you're looking for more resources to go from surviving to thriving, check out our website at www.markjeweltraining.com. That's Jewel with 2 L's. And you can find us under Mark Jewel Speaking and Training on all the major social networks. Remember, survival is dead. It's your time to thrive today. See you next week.